Can everybody hear me and see me? If you can say yes or hello. Or maybe type what time it is in your country. It's midday here, and we have over 400 people now from different parts of the world, so I'm interested to know what time it is. Got all sorts of different times: 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 9 p.m. for somebody, 7. So some of you it's very early in the morning, a 6 o'clock start for one person there. Excellent. Very nice to see everybody. And I'm assuming the sound and image is fine and everybody can see slides. That's great. Okay, so in the next hour, we're going to look at critical thinking, in particular at lower levels. Now, if you've attended my webinars before, you know that I've talked about critical thinking before. But I've talked about it in quite a general way in terms of defining it. And one of the questions that I get a lot from teachers around the world and so on is asking me, yeah, critical thinking's interesting, but can it really work with lower level learners? For example, with beginners, elementary and pre-intermediate. So what we thought we'd do today is a session looking particularly at the lower levels and the types of activities we might do. Now, to do this, we're going to do a little bit of theory, a bit of background methodology. So I'm just going to clarify my definition of what critical thinking is. Then we're going to consider what some of the challenges are for lower level learners, and perhaps you can write about some of the difficulties sometimes you have if you have critical thinking tasks with lower level learners. And then the main part of the session is to look at some practical ideas. So there'll be about 10 or 15 minutes of theory, and then we'll get on to some practical tips of things you can do with your students to experiment and try to bring in critical thinking into the classroom. Okay, so let's get going because we've got quite a lot to get through. There will be time for questions at the end, although if you have a particular question during the session, feel free to use the chat box, and I am going to ask you to use the chat box at certain times. First of all, a definition of critical thinking. On the slide, you can see something which I've shown people before. So if you've heard of Bloom's taxonomy, can you just type Bloom or yes or something in the chat box so everybody knows? Yep, lots of people typing yes. Good. I'm just going to have a glass of water. Lovely. So what we're looking at here is an adaptation on this slide. There should be a green arrow on the slide as well. This is an adaptation or a revision of Bloom's taxonomy, which was done in 2001 by a group led by somebody called Krathwohl. And here's the basic theory, that when our students are thinking and learning, they're either using lower order thinking or they're using higher order thinking. Yep. Now, in Bloom's original theory, it was quite hierarchical. So he would say that students start by remembering and recalling information. So remembering and recalling facts, for example. Then the next level is that they would have to show that they'd understood that information. So imagine you teach students a new word, they have to remember it, then they have to show that they've understood it. Yep. And the next step in thinking would be to apply that word. Maybe they use it in a gap fill, or they use it in some kind of controlled situation to demonstrate that they've understood the word, so they can apply it. Yeah. And we do this in the classroom a lot, so that we present new language, students maybe do some control practice, and we just check that they know how to use the new word. Okay, it's very straightforward. It's what we do every day in lessons. However, sometimes if we want the students to start using higher order thinking, we might ask them to analyze the language in some way and discover something about the language. We might, for example, give them a reading text and we get them to read it and then analyze language in it and discover a new rule, for example. We might get them to evaluate the use of language in a text. And this is all higher order thinking. It's much more difficult in many ways, so it's more challenging to students. And then right at the top, we get students to create something, perhaps produce something. Maybe we ask them to give a presentation or write a story or make a video, even something creative in the classroom, which is kind of fun to do. But it works much better if they've used their other higher order thinking skills. So this is basically what higher and lower order thinking is about, and it's kind of Bloom's taxonomy, and it's adapted. And originally, when Bloom invented his taxonomy, he saw it very much as a hierarchical. He would say that you can't do higher order thinking until you've done lower order thinking. However, in the 21st century, we don't necessarily believe that. We think we can play around. For example, I could start a lesson by asking students to do something very creative, and then perhaps I could ask them to read a text or learn some new vocabulary and then do other things. So I don't necessarily always start at the bottom and finish at the top. I can do things in different orders. In terms of critical thinking, it's useful to look at, Manoy said, as you move to the top of the pyramid, does the importance decrease? No, I think the importance is equal. I think it's as important to have remembering and understanding as it is to have creativity. If we look at this in terms of critical thinking, we can kind of see Bloom's taxonomy like this, that the lower order thinking generally is connected with basic comprehension. So it might be learning new vocabulary and understanding and applying that vocabulary, okay? The next three levels, apply, analyze, and evaluate, they all involve some critical thinking, in which we're asking students to use their higher order thinking and think more deeply about language. And quite often in classrooms, this is the bit that doesn't happen. Often we miss it out. We do the lower order thinking and then we go to the next exercise and we learn more language. But the students don't have an opportunity to think critically about the language that they're working with. And then finally at the top, you've got the creative thinking, which we can treat as its own category as well. The important thing to understand about this is that you should see lower order and higher order thinking as a continuum. So in any good language lesson or in any kind of lesson, we're always switching between lower order thinking to higher order thinking and back again, and it's continuous, and that way we really know that we're tapping into the students' different levels of thinking. Okay. Now, there's a problem here. Here's the problem. Quite often when we teach language with lower level students, we use a lot of lower order thinking because we're introducing language for the first time. And the problem is when we get to the apply stage, we often don't get students to think critically. And Manoy's just made a good point in the chat room. It's one of the reasons that we focus on the lower order thinking skills with the lower levels. And sometimes we don't get students to think critically. And often in higher level course books, you'll see special sections on critical thinking. But often with lower level books, you don't. And this presents a problem for the teacher because is critical thinking something we can only do with higher levels? That's my question. So what I thought I would do because I want you to think critically. Some people are typing no, we'll see. To get you think critically, I thought we'd have a poll, and I'm going to ask Emily if she can bring the poll over. Now, the poll is very simple. You look at A, B, C, or D, you read the descriptor, and you decide which you agree with most. You might think there's more than one answer, but go ahead, just click one of the answers, and let's see what the 535 people in this room all think. I'm really interested to see what your feelings are. Don't type in the chat box, put it into the poll on the screen. You should be able to click onto the screen, and then we can really see visually what you think. I'm getting you to do a little bit of research here because I want to know what teachers around the world think. Lots of people are typing B at the moment. Some people said B and C. I mean, it maybe there's more than one answer, and it depends on the context and these kinds of things that come up. I don't know how many people have answered yet. We've got 538 people in the room, and I'm looking, we've got about over 300 people have answered. Yeah, Lynn's made a good point. Chosen B, but it depends on the motivation of the learner. Yes, Svetlana, we're trying to develop a bit of teacher critical thinking. It's very important that teachers think critically as well. Any more answers? Lots of people going for B. Okay. Let's take a look. Emily's closing the poll. Okay, so B seems to be the popular answer. For me, A, B, and C might be correct in different situations. I didn't put the poll up thinking there was one correct answer. I just put the poll up because I was sort of interested in different views. D is an interesting answer. I don't agree with D personally, but if you look at lots of language lessons and you look at lots of course books, quite often they don't include critical thinking tasks at lower levels. It's as if they believe D, because they think that students just need to use lower order thinking. So I think you could answer A, B, and C, and it would apply in different contexts. My general feeling, my own personal feeling, is that B is quite often correct. It's more challenging to do. I also think, yeah, Guadalupe, I'm defining critical thinking as the higher order thinking skills between comprehension and creativity. So it's evaluating and analyzing and so on. So it's interesting to see people's response. We all seem to agree that critical thinking is good at lower levels, but it's more challenging to do. Let's look at this in more detail now. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to create what I'm calling the critical thinking paradox. This is one of the challenges for teachers. Basically, what happens quite often with students when they have low-level English, we often seem to think it means, or the way materials are presented is, we sometimes think it means they have low-level intelligence, so that the kinds of materials we sometimes have to use in the classroom don't really challenge the students' critical thinking. However, I think that just because students have a lower level of English, that doesn't mean they have low level intelligence. So we need to teach low level language, but we also need to give them texts and exercises that challenge their intelligence as though they have higher level intelligence. It's a mistake if we confuse low level English only with lower level low-level thinking. And I'm glad some of you seem to agree. Exactly, it discourages them if we do the other. There's a problem here, and that is that tasks that are often aimed at higher order thinking in course materials often require higher level language. For example, when we give students problem solving tasks, quite often they need a high level of English in order to complete the task. Or if we, for example, ask students to do look at an authentic reading text, then sometimes if it's authentic, it means that they need higher level English. So the challenge we have to do is to introduce lower order thinking activities we have to introduce higher order thinking activities for lower level learners. And that's quite a challenge, or it can be sometimes. Now, I think one of the reasons that teachers often don't do critical thinking tasks with lower levels is because we often seem to use high level language to talk about critical thinking. So there is what I would call a false perception of critical thinking. The false perception is this: we often use words like analyze, evaluate, bias, perspective, judgment, relevance, even a word like elucidation. And you see these words used in course books. But what level of student do you think, what level would they need to be in order to understand those words? If you're familiar with CFR levels, do they have to be B1, B2, C1? What level do you think? Yeah, and Feast is saying B2. Some of the words could be B1, like compare, but for example, a word like elucidation would be C1, for example. And what often happens is that these kinds of words appear in course books and they put teachers off from using critical thinking with lower levels. But I think this is a false perception. I think the real challenge is that we have to grade our language to talk about critical thinking in the same way that we grade our language to talk about anything else. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Let's go back to our lower and higher order thinking. Laura has answered the question. She said, grade the activity. Exactly. Let's look at some things a teacher might say in a classroom. For example, an activity involving remembering, a teacher might say, listen to these words and repeat them. Now, my beginner and my elementary students would understand that instruction. Yep, because they hear it all the time in class. I want them to listen and repeat, and it helps with lower order thinking and memory. The teacher might want them to understand and would give them a sentence like, read the text and answer the true-false questions. That kind of exercise is checking their understanding. But the language the teacher's using is still low-level language. Applying, work in pairs, plan a holiday with phrases. So the students have listened to something and we've pulled out phrases, and now I want the students to apply that language. So they're starting to use slightly higher order thinking. Now I want my students to start to use higher order thinking, but they're still low level. So what would that task be? A teacher might say, work in groups, read a list of ideas on a topic. It could be any topic. Which do you like and why? Now this language here, this is still low level language. It's probably A1, A2 language. And the important word there is why, as Claude has just said. Why is the key word, because we start pushing the students into the higher order thinking and into analysis. Let's go further than that. Let's go into evaluate. If students are working in a group and they're looking at different ideas or they're brainstorming, the teacher might say, choose the best idea in your group. This is real higher order thinking, but the language level is still low. The instructions are still low level. Until finally, I want the students to do a creative thinking task. I want them to present their idea to the class. MRE, to some extent, yes, this is task-based learning, and task-based learning would be a good example of activity types that often require critical thinking and problem-solving skills, for example, but we can do them with lower-level speakers. I think that would be a good example of a good methodology. My point is very simple here, and I'm sure many of you do these kinds of activities. All I'm saying to you is that even at low levels, this kind of critical thinking task can occur. It's all about grading the level of the task carefully and grading the level of the language. So I'm not saying anything particularly controversial. I'm just reminding us that low-level speakers can still do higher-order tasks. Okay, what I want to do now is to look at some very practical ideas. So I've done some theoretical work. Let's have a look at sort of 10 ways that we might introduce critical thinking to lower levels. Some of these activities you'll be familiar with. I'm going to go past here, so 10 ways. First of all, my tip number 1 is teach students the key language they need to do critical thinking tasks. So in the same way that the teacher grades their language to give instructions, I think we can think about the kind of language that students need at low levels. For example, students often need to ask questions in critical thinking tasks. Well, that's not a problem because all those questions with 1 asterisk are A1 type questions. So the type of questions we ask in beginner classes. Yeah. If I want students to give an opinion, again, the single asterisk represents A1. A double asterisk represents an A2 word. So I can teach students this language, and now they can express an opinion. And I can give this to elementary students, and they can start to give their opinion. So the important thing is to think of, to do the task, what kind of low-level language can I give students? I don't need to give them that much. I can teach them phrases like, I think, I know that. I can teach students that adjectives of opinion are really useful, like excellent, great, good, okay, really simple level. I can also make use of the fact at A1 level, I will teach the words because, so, and or, which is the language for giving reason and options, which is also useful for critical thinking tasks. Comparing and contrasting. All of those phrases, it's better than, the best, the most important, but, however, that we use them all at A1 level. We introduce them. And finally, adding and giving examples. We've got words like and, also, for example. Okay, in addition has 3 dots. That would be a B1 word. Normally we teach it at B1 level. My point is here, think about what critical thinking type language you can teach even at the low levels. It doesn't have to be high level language. Okay, so that's tip number 1. Teach them that language even at beginner and elementary level as soon as you can, and you can start to give them. Okay, let's have a look at slide number 2. Encourage students to use open questions. Okay. When we teach question forms to students, It's really important to teach students open questions as quickly as you can. I like to tell my students, if you want to be a critical thinker, then use open questions more than closed questions. Let me give you a little task. Here are 6 questions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What is the grammatical connection between those 6 questions? Type it in the chat box if you know the answer. Correct. Scott wins the prize because he got it first. He said they're yes/no questions or closed questions. And closed questions tend to, all they do is get yes/no answers. So they're not so useful for critical thinking. So a little exercise you can do with your students, and this makes a good warmer to any lesson, is to write 6 yes/no questions on the board. You could choose questions that you've been teaching in the last 3 or 4 weeks, yeah? So it could be a revision task. You put the students into pairs, and then you add these open questions at the bottom: what, where, who, why, and so on. Student A, in their pairs, student A asks a closed question: are you a student? Student B answers yes or no because it's a closed question, and student A has to choose any open question. So, and then create a new question. For example, what do you study? And then student B says, I study English, for example. So it's got 2 purposes. It's a grammatical exercise, revising questions or revising any of the language you've been doing in the last few weeks, because you choose closed questions from recent lessons. And for 10 minutes, students take turns to ask open and closed question. So let's try it to test you. I want you to turn question 5 into an open question. So rewrite question 5, put it in the chat box. Choose any. So what food do you like from different countries would be one question, Magdalena. Yep. Any other questions? What's your favorite? Which is your favorite? Maria can't see the slides, sorry. When did you try it last? And so on. Okay, so very quickly we've generated lots of new open questions. And you can just do this with students working in pairs until they work through all 6 questions. It's not hugely higher order thinking, but it's more higher order than the simple closed yes/no questions. It's generating more language, and it's a more interesting task in that sense. Okay. So tip number 2 is to introduce open questions as quickly as you can into lower levels, because it's good for critical mindset. Okay. Exactly, Scott. It's also generating conversation practice. And it's an interesting skill. If you teach business English students and you're teaching the skill of networking, we often teach business students, remember to ask open questions more than closed questions, because open questions generate more conversation. So yes, Antoine, if you teach the English for small talk, it's a really useful exercise because it gets students generating more conversation. If you only ask yes/no questions, conversations just stop. Okay. So open questions are doing a couple of things, but they are getting students to develop a critical mindset. Okay, let's look at slide number 3. I don't have too much to say about this because recently the last webinar I did was on personalization. If you're interested in the topic of personalization, you can just go and watch my last webinar. But I think personalization and applying it to materials is really useful for very basic thinking, and it improves students' critical thinking and it creates a critical mindset. Now, what we've done with Life 2nd edition is I'm currently working on some free grammar worksheets which you can get from the website. and I'm writing them so that for every unit with Life Second Edition, there's free grammar worksheets, and you'll get more information this later on as Life Second Edition comes out. But I thought it was interesting because I'm writing this at the moment. I share with you the beginner. This is the very first worksheet that I've written to go with the book. So it's Life Beginner Level, Unit 1A. And as you'd expect with beginner level, we're doing the verb to be. So they're really simple exercises, yeah? It's beginner level, nothing complicated. But the important thing when teaching grammar or any kind of vocabulary is to introduce personalization as quickly as you can. Because as soon as you add personalization, the students see the relevance, but they're also applying language and they're having to think more deeply, even at beginner. So here they're putting in their own name, and here in 5 they're writing in the names of people they're with, and they have to communicate with them. So even at that really low level, personalization just gets the students to start thinking with slightly more higher order thinking. And personalization is a nice technique. As I say, I did a webinar on personalization. You can go and watch the recording, and there's more activities. So I'm going to go straight to 4. Exercise 4. This is a simple exercise you can use with any of your lessons, okay? Really simple to use in your class. So imagine you are teaching the vocabulary of furniture in the house. So exercise 1, you've got to fill the gaps with sofa, painting, curtains, cupboard and lamp. Yep. But a really simple way to get students to use their higher order thinking is not to give another gap fill, but to get students to create their own gap fill. So for example, they have to write their own sentences using the word desk, plant, carpet, TV, a photo, and then they give it to their partner. The point of this is that if students can create their own exercises, they're going to remember the words so much more, but it also requires a lot of higher order thinking. But you can use this with any language exercise. If you're using a course book tomorrow and teach some vocabulary, just do this with the students. Let's try this out. We'll have a quick competition. Could you write a similar gap sentence with the word desk? Okay, let's see who can write the best one in the chat room. Write me a gap fill with desk. The desk comes from IKEA. Very nice. Where is your desk? Okay, Guadalupe, but you need some more context than that, because the other students got, I write at my desk is nice. The book is on the desk. The book's, oh gosh, the ideas are rushing by. There are lots of books on my desk. That's quite a nice one. Don't sit on the desk. Very good. Your desk is a mess. Yes. Okay, you get the idea. It's challenging enough for students to write, for teachers to write effective gap fills, but it's really nice to let the students have a go at it. And I think this links to the theory that probably the best way to learn something is to try and teach it. I'll repeat that. One of the best ways to learn something is to try and teach it. And what's happening here is in exercise 2 is that students are trying to teach the vocabulary to their partner. And it's really using their higher order thinking. So very simple exercise that you can use at low levels. You can use it with low levels and high levels, but it's just tapping into the higher order thinking. So worth using with your students, and nice as a revision exercise. Let's go to tip 5. Tip number 5. This is an important one for critical thinking. Get students to say why. Now, the question why is one of those questions we need to teach students or get students to answer to develop their critical thinking, because quite often for higher order thinking, why is such an important word. Similarly, the word because is really important, because it's the word that answers the question why. And quite often this is requiring students to use higher order thinking. So let's take this example. Here we go. This is from Life Elementary 2nd edition, and they've got some opinion adjectives: fantastic, not bad, fun, nice, boring, etc. You put them, they have to put them into the category. So this is checking lower order thinking, okay? It's checking that they understand the vocabulary. Now we want them to apply it. And what they have to do is complete a sentence, and there are 4 sentences here. They put an adjective in there, and then, but the difference is they have to add a reason. And where there's because is where you add the critical thinking. So, today is fantastic because I'm doing a webinar, for example, okay? I'm personalizing it, okay? So, it's Monday. You've all just had a weekend, so in the chat box, can you complete the sentence, last weekend was something, because, and give me a reason. Just simple sentence, tell me about your weekend, but give me a reason. Last weekend was relaxing because I stayed at home. It was boring because I stayed at home. Now that's interesting because we've got 2 different opinions for the same reason. It was boring because it was raining. And lots of things are rushing by. Somebody had a great weekend because they went whitewater river rafting. It was fantastic because we had political elections in Italy. I bet it was a very exciting weekend, actually. It was surreal because of the heavy snowfall, and so on and so on and so on. So we've got lots of different ideas on the weekend. So there's an element of personalization there. But what I'm doing is asking you to give reasons why. Just because of the word because. And I've added a little bit of critical thinking and a little bit of creative thinking in order to use that language. Because the first exercise is just lower order thinking, but the second exercise adds some higher order thinking. So it's really a simple demonstration of how we can integrate it into lower level teaching. And it's always worth, when you do these exercises with vocabulary and grammar, is how can you add a little bit of higher order thinking to it. So that was tip number 5. I've only got 20 minutes left, so I'm going to rush to the next bit. With reading skills, quite often when we teach reading to low-level learners, so the text here, if you're from Colombia, you will like this text. The reading text here is about Cali in southwest Colombia. Do we have anybody in the webinar from Colombia or from Cali? Somebody from Colombia. Liliana is from Cali, I think, or Colombia anyway. Here's a text about Cali. It's quite low level. It's very factual. Okay? And if I'm teaching reading skills, I can ask basic comprehension questions like this. But all I'm doing is checking facts. So it's not a very interesting reading exercise. It's just checking facts, and I'm controlling the information. Okay? So it's lower order thinking, but it's just fact checking. And they're very basic comprehension questions. It's fine to do this. They're helping with lower order thinking. So you should give these kinds of questions to low-level learners and to high-level learners. But we want to do more with it. Let me show you a more interesting exercise. Here's a more interesting exercise. You've got 2 texts about Cali, text 1, and then another text about Cali. Now, I'm not giving comprehension questions here, but I want the students to decide who did the writer write each text for, and what are the topics. So in text number 1 here, what kind of reader is this text for? What kind of person is interested in this text? A business person, Antoine's saying. Tourists, maybe. In fact, they're both for tourists, but the first text is probably more for business people because it's talking about restaurants, hotels, and it has a lot of business. The second text is more about tourism. Yep. It talks about dance and festivals, and so it's going to get people who are interested in the arts. Now, what level would you say these two paragraphs, what level of student could read these paragraphs, do you think? Some people are saying B1, A2, some people are saying A1. It'll depend a bit on your context and the type of level of students, but you'd agree they're quite low-level texts in general. And I think they're more interesting texts than the previous one, which was very factual. And what we're doing here is we're taking quite low-level texts, and instead of giving fact-checking comprehension questions, we're getting students to compare two different texts about the same place. And what students are doing is learning how to write a text for the reader, because quite often when students write texts, they don't think about the person that they're writing for. And the text, Elaine has used the word there, it has to be involving. The text is more involving when it's written for a particular person. Now, if we give students text like this about a place and they compare, we can then give them an exercise like this. Now, typically, when we teach students about writing a paragraph, we'd say write a paragraph about your town, but we don't say why they're writing it for the town. So say to the students, think about the type of reader, think about the type of topics. So we're giving them the model, as Linda's just said, but now they're thinking about who is the reader? Who are they writing this paragraph for? If they just write a paragraph because the teacher said write a paragraph, you'll get something very boring with lots of facts. If you say write your paragraph for a business person, or write it for a tourist, or write it for a student, you'll get much more interesting language used and much better quality writing, to be honest. And that's where the critical thinking comes in. So think about how you're teaching reading or what kind of reading skills you're teaching. That was tip number 6. Okay, here's tip number 7. If any of you know about Life, and here's the Life 2nd edition. The British English version's just come out and the American English version will come out soon. In Life, you know that if you've used it, we have reading pages and we have critical thinking sections in the reading pages. And one of the critical thinking tasks we have is for students to decide whether a sentence is fact or opinion. And with the 2nd edition, we've tried to be much more controlled about the critical thinking. We think that we've improved our critical thinking syllabus and that we've got a lot more in there for lower level learners, okay? Now, if you look at these two examples, I've taken these from 2 different levels of book. Example A, we're asking the students to look for fact opinion. Example B comes from a higher level book, but they're looking for fact opinion. Just look at the 2 exercises. What is the difference between the 2 exercises? Example B has something different about it. And I'll have some water. Yeah, Irina and Scott have answered the question. So it's this bit in C. Instead of just looking for fact and opinion, I'm looking at the reporting of other people's opinion. And the advantage of that is that I'm focusing on reported speech. Yes, Olga, of course, it's an obvious question, I know. But we're getting them to look at reported speech. And what they're starting to notice is phrases like, some people also think that, or people said they were bored, for example. So the critical thinking task is doing two things. It's raising students' awareness to the difference between fact and opinion in written text, but it's also getting students to notice the way language is used. And example B exercise introduces reported speech. And example B comes from the pre-intermediate book where we introduce reported speech. Example A is from the elementary book. We don't introduce reported speech. So my message here is that when you design critical thinking tasks, in the same way that you grade the language level, you have to grade the critical thinking task. You have to think about what is it asking the students to do, and can they do it with the language they have and at the level they're at. So we have to think these things through as teachers when we're designing these tasks. It's about grading the language, and it's also grading the critical thinking task. That's tip number 7. Okay, we're nearly coming to the end now. Tip number 8, use information-rich photos. Okay, the picture in front of you comes from Life Elementary 2. It is not an information-rich photo. There's a reason I used it. I used this exercise to teach students vocabulary. This comes from the elementary book, and students have to match words to the pictures. That's fine. It's lower order thinking. Yep. Okay. It's just checking that students understand the words. Okay. That's all it's doing. But it's not what I would call information rich. The topic is possessions, things that you might take away with you or use. Yeah. Here is an example of an information rich photo. And you can see why it's information rich. It still has objects. It has shoes, it has balls, it has chairs, it has different possessions. But the pictures are in context. And so now, instead of just teaching vocabulary, I can start to ask students questions. I could say, what does the photograph show? Why have they got all the objects there? Jacques just suggested it's a garage sale. It might be. You could say, why does the family have all of these objects? Maybe they're decluttering, although that's a high level word, but yeah, they could be. I could ask the students, what are the objects made of? And Julius said they're things made of plastic. That's the topic. The point is that we've gone from a very simple picture for teaching vocabulary to putting the objects into context and creating classroom discussion. And I just think the picture is more interesting because it's information rich and the objects are in context. So what I would suggest is when you're teaching vocabulary, teach vocabulary with pictures at low levels, but try to find pictures of vocabulary within context and use both. Use single images and use information-rich images, because the information-rich helps with the critical thinking. Okay, we're coming close to the end. Tip number 9. Remember that critical thinking leads into creative thinking. And I really like this photograph. We used this photograph at the beginning of a chapter called Stages in Life. And I thought it was a good picture because we've got a picture of the much older woman, the middle-aged woman, and the young woman. And so I introduced the topic of age and differences between age groups. So it's a nice critical thinking, information-rich image. But I can also use it to generate creativity. In this particular image, I like to use it with students to get them writing text messages. Okay? So here's the writing situation. So we'll have a bit of creativity. The two women, the two older women, the middle-aged woman, the older woman, are making conversation. They're waiting at a train station, okay? And they're communicating with each other. Who do you think the younger woman is talking to? Just write in the chat box. She's correct, Antoine. She's writing to a friend. Okay, let's just say it's to a friend. Okay. What do you think she is texting about? What do you think she's texting about? She might be talking about lunch, gossip. Yeah, somebody just said it. She's talking about the two women she sat next to. What she's doing is listening to the two women, and she's texting her friend. So what I want you to do, a little bit of creative thinking. Can you type in the chat box what you think the younger woman is texting to her friend? Just write me a short text message. And let's see what you think she's saying about the two women. That they're loud? Yep, could be. Could be texting, they're talking about their health problems. They're so cute. I wish they'd shut up. Costas. I'm reading these as quickly as I can. They're talking about politics. She's annoyed about them. They're weird. Okay. They're talking. They're like my mum. They're talking about their pets. Okay. They haven't seen each other for a long time. Okay. They're talking about their health. Yes. I'm similar age to the woman in the middle, and I'd probably talk about my health a lot. Okay. All right. You get the idea. My message here is that when you choose information-rich photos, they also allow you to generate creativity if you choose the right kind of photo. And this example is interesting because it actually generates writing practice, quick texting practice, and it gets the students to think creatively. So I can ask critical thinking questions about this picture. I can ask students about the difference. I can ask them to compare the people. I can ask them to evaluate the differences between those people. But it also generates some creative thinking as well. The other thing about photographs in the classroom is quite often I ask students also to take photographs. So the title of this photograph is Stages in Life. I could then say to students for homework, can you take a photograph called Stages in Life? And maybe they'd photograph members of their family at home and bring them into class and present their photographs. So photographs are a great way to introduce creative thinking into the classroom, and it takes us from critical thinking into creative thinking. Okay, here we go, my final tip. The final tip in this session is that as teachers we have to think critically, and we have to teach using lower order and higher order thinking. Here's an example from a course book. It's from the grammar of a course book. Now we've got two ways of presenting the grammar, yeah? In the one at the bottom, we're telling the students how to form the past simple regular verbs. Yep. It's the kind of things you see in grammar study books. We give students the rule. Yep. In the one above, students have to read the sentence and then they have to answer the questions about the sentences in order to learn the rule. Is there one that you prefer more than other as a teacher? Do you like the one at the top or the one at the bottom? There isn't a correct answer here. I'm just asking you. Okay, some people are saying it depends on the student. I think that's a really good answer because some students hate it. As teachers, quite often we like the one at the top because students are discovering the answer. Students often just say, tell me the answer. And we need to just tell them and explain the grammar. Here's what I think is that we need to basically teach both. The one lower down we call deductive learning, the one above we call inductive. So with deductive learning, we tell students the rule. With inductive learning, they learn the rule. The deductive tends to draw on lower order thinking. Okay? I mean, this is low level grammar. I could teach this at elementary and pre-intermediate. And with lower levels, we often use deductive reasoning to give students the rule, or we might even translate it for them. But for higher order thinking, we also need to give them rules which are in inductive. So for me, actually, as lots of you said, the important thing is to use both techniques. For example, often I might give the top one to students first, and then I'd say, now look at the bottom one and check your answers, because the bottom one's giving you the answer. And what we do in live second edition, quite often we put the inductive grammar in the front of the book and students read it, and then they can look at the back of the book and check using the deductive grammar. And in that way, we're using lower order and higher order thinking, and we're combining basic understanding with critical thinking in the way we approach the grammar. Lelia, I'm going to give you some more links at the end. Claude mentions a good point. Some students have learned the rules through deductive means before being exposed to the inductive teaching. That's absolutely fine. If students have learned this way, the deductive way, then it makes it interesting to use the inductive approach in class. But the important thing is to get the balance between the lower and the higher order thinking. Okay, that's my tip number 10. I'm coming to the end of my session, so my summary slide is this. Those are the 10 practical ways to integrate critical thinking at lower levels. Try some of them out with your students, see how they work. In particular, my favorites are make students create an exercise. I think it's a lot of fun. 5, get students to say why when you teach vocabulary. Also, think about going beyond the basic comprehension question with readings. And also, when you teach, use more than one approach for teaching. Teach the grammar one way one day and teach it again the next day. Use a different approach. Okay, to sum up, at the beginning I talked about the critical thinking paradox, and I said there's a problem because with higher order tasks, quite often students have to use higher level language. Actually, the solution to this is quite straightforward, and it's here. The critical thinking solution is that tasks that are aimed at higher order thinking, they don't always have to use higher level language. Okay? Grade your language and you're still using higher order thinking with the students and critical thinking. Okay? Thanks very much for attending. If you have time, you will get a recording. There'll be a recording of this webinar. I would like to invite you to complete a critical thinking survey, which is on the InFocus website. It would be great if you would take part, because I'm doing some research with my colleague Paul Dummett. It'd be really helpful if you could participate and answer the questions in the survey. Okay, you'll find that on the InFocus website. Okay, and just to let you know that Life second edition is out in all 6 levels. The British English version is out. The American English version will be out very soon, and you'll see that we've done a lot with the critical thinking. Thanks very much for taking part, and I'm going to hand over to Emily because